Hey there, this is Confirmation Lesson 5 Part 2. We have gone through a lot of material so far. We are getting ready to finish up the outward disciplines. So we already talked about the outward disciplines of um, solitude and simplicity. Now we're going to look at the outward disciplines of submission and service. Submission is a hard word to hear. Submission, for a lot of us, sounds like we are going to completely get rid of control. We are going to lose complete control, and that's a very scary thing. But Richard Foster notes that is also kind of the point. Richard Foster writes, I said that every discipline has its corresponding freedom. What freedom corresponds to submission? It is the ability to lay down the terrible burden of always needing to get our own way. I've really felt this one lately. And I have 3 young daughters who are out of control more often than not, and trying to get my way in the house is almost impossible. And yet I still have this desire to do that. I still want my daughters to do what I want them to do. I just want them to get with the program. And sometimes, that will also happen between me and my wife. I'm just like, why can't she get it? Why can't she just go along with what I want? And it is a terrible burden to hold on to. And the discipline of submission means saying, I don't have to get my way. I don't have to get my way because my way isn't always the best way. I don't have to get my way because I want God to have his way, and if God has his way, I'm okay with it. Richard Foster notes that a lot of times we build up so many of our issues to be these big major things, and honestly, when we get to the end of it, we realize that a lot of them really don't matter. And that's where submission comes into play. We are able to lay down all of these issues that aren't important. And in the discipline of submission, we learn what things really matter. The discipline of submission isn't, well, I'm just never going to have an opinion. The discipline of submission is being able to only hold on to those opinions that matter the most. Some people will think that with submission, with self-denial, which Jesus talks about a lot, that this is going to be self-hatred. Like, you have to hate yourself so much to put yourself there. Richard Foster writes, on the contrary, Jesus calls us to self-denial without self-hatred. Self-denial is simply a way of coming to understand that we do not have to have our own way. Our happiness is not dependent upon getting what we want. And he continues, self-denial is not the same thing as self-contempt. Self-contempt claims that we have no worth. And even if we do have worth, we should reject it. Self-denial declares that we are of infinite worth and shows us how to realize it. That our worth isn't dependent on us getting what we want. Our worth isn't dependent on us making things work out. Our worth isn't dependent on us being in control. The discipline of submission reminds us that we have infinite worth. We have a worth that can never be decreased. And so we can deny ourselves and we can submit even to the most debased things, even to some of the lowest things, even to things that we couldn't possibly think we could lower ourselves to. Paul talks about doing that himself. The Bible talks, David talks about becoming even more undignified for the sake of God. And this is what the discipline of submission is supposed to do. Another thing that we will sometimes look at with submission is we ask people to submit so that they can be controlled by someone else. We fear Paul's words on submission, asking wives to submit to their husbands because we think it creates a hierarchy, and suddenly you have some people submitting to others, and this is just the way for the powers that be to get their way. I think sometimes that's what we fear when we hear submission. Richard Foster notes that for groups like wives and children and slaves, the only meaningful reason for such a command to subordination, to submit, the only meaningful reason for such a command was the fact that by virtue of the gospel message, they had come to see themselves as free from a subordinate status in society. The gospel had challenged all second-class citizenships, and they knew it. Richard Foster also notes the cross life of Jesus undermined all social orders based on power and self-interest. The discipline of submission, far from reinforcing the power structures that exist, subvert it in the only way to really tear it down. We think that to break up the power structures of the world, we have to become revolutionaries. We have to rise to the top. And once we gain power, we can get rid of them. But the discipline of submission says that the real way to break them apart is to refuse to take part in them at all. We submit in all sorts of ways. I would encourage you, if you're getting ready to walk into submission as a discipline, there are extreme ways it gets taken, and maybe you try some of those. Try not saying no to things that people ask for a while. It'll be so hard. Or not disagreeing with people for a period of time. It's so hard to do that. That is submitting. You're submitting to them, saying, I don't have to get my way. I don't have to make my opinion heard. I don't have to get my way to happen here. The only way to really practice submission is to just start trying it. Try to do those things that mean submission. And the final outward discipline is the discipline of service. And with the discipline of service, we worry so much that people are going to abuse it. I'll hear it all the time. I'll even think about it. Like, does that person deserve it? Won't they abuse it? The person begging for money, we question all of their motives. We wonder if they're really going to actually need the money we give them, or are they just going to abuse us of it? And in the disciplines of submission and service, we worry about that we'll get taken advantage of. But in the discipline of service, we are kind of giving those things up. We're saying that we are going to submit and we're going to serve. And sometimes when we go about service, we would almost rather do the big things. It's almost easier to serve in big ways. You're going to go over to India to serve with the Sisters of Mercy, with Mother Teresa's, the group that followed after her, and do all of these huge things. Richard Foster writes, in service we must experience the many little deaths of going beyond ourselves. The little deaths of going beyond ourselves. And Richard Foster notes, Francis de Sales says that the great virtues and the small fidelities are like sugar and salt. Sugar may have a more exquisite taste, but its use is less frequent. Salt is found everywhere. The great virtues are a rare occurrence. The ministry of small things is a daily service. Large tasks require great sacrifice for a moment. Small things require constant sacrifice. And in service, that's what we're called to. And we might get called on those huge things, but more likely, we are going to be called to a number of small, little mundane things. And about that fear of who we serve and how we'll be abused, Richard Foster writes this: right here, we must see the difference between choosing to serve and choosing to be a servant. When we choose to serve, we are still in charge. We decide whom we will serve and when we will serve. And if we are in charge, we will worry a great deal about anyone stepping on us, that is, taking charge over us. But when we choose to be a servant, we give up the right to be in charge. There is great freedom in this. If we voluntarily choose to be taken advantage of, then we cannot be manipulated. When we choose to be a servant, we surrender the right to decide who and when we will serve. We become available and vulnerable. That really is at the heart of the discipline of service. We want to be in charge. We want to be the one in control. But that's not part of what service is. There are a lot of different types of service. And I'm just going to name off a bunch that he references before I get into something that'll be very important for us going through confirmation. So the different types of service are hidden service, service in small things, service of guarding the reputation of others or speaking ill of no one, the service of being served, the service of common courtesy, the service of hospitality, the service of listening, the service of bearing the burdens of each other, and the service of sharing the word of life to each other. All of those things are acts of service. But as we are going through all of this, when you go through taking your vows, remember we vowed to reject evil and to embrace the good. That is a vow to service. And I've heard it said that there are three primary forms of service. There's a service of time, a service of talent, and a service of treasure. The service of time is about attending church, but it's more than that. It'll cover any commitment you make. It is saying that you will allow some of your time to be taken up by the things of the church. You will commit to attending Sunday school, Bible studies. You will commit to opening up time to help others. You will be present. That is a service of time. A service of talent can go two ways. It means that you will do what you can to help God in the church. And sometimes that is doing what you do best. That is a great service of talent, saying, I am really good in this area, so I'm going to use that for the church as best as I can. And hopefully your church has room for that. I hope that my churches will make room to do that. I hope your church has room for you to do that. But there's also a service of talent where you do the thing that needs to be done just because it's needed and you're available. It's not the thing you want to do. It's not the thing you like to do. You serve the church by doing it just because the church needs it. And finally, there's the service of treasure. When we talk about simplicity, in some ways it's that. You are giving. You're giving of money. You are giving of possessions. It will include tithing, which is giving 10% of your income before taxes. That's the traditional view of tithing. But it's so much more of that. It's exposing God to use all of it. So I hope this week you look at how can you submit, how can you serve, how can you allow God to have that control over you? Because in giving God that control, you will draw closer to God.